What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. It has been a little over a year and a half since I picked up the R32. Actually put about 16,000 miles on it in that year and a half. And right after I got it, you guys may remember we did a bunch of upgrades, some performance, some maintenance. Things like brake pads, rotors, and lines all the way around, including a brake fluid service, front and rear suspension, a bunch of bushings up front, including the control arm bushings, sway bar bushings, and upper strut tower bushings. We did a thermostat, housing, and all that, headlights, and a bunch of other little things. Well, what today I really want to do is kind of go back through some of those mods we made and see how they're holding up. What do the bushings look like after a year of 15,000 miles? I'm really curious on how everything's worn and performed over that year and a half. Also, I'm going to be putting new brake pads all the way around the car. I'm not going to be replacing the rotors. I'm going to show you guys what I'm going to do to the rotors because I have slotted rotors. Most places won't turn them or cut them or resurface them. So we're going to be using this brake rotor hone just to clean the surface up before we put our new pads on it. Also, I'm going to be doing a brake fluid service because this car has been through a handful of high performance events. So I want to make sure that's fresh and clean for an upcoming autocross. Also, we're going to check in on that Tyrol Sport brake stiffening kit and see how those caliper slides are performing. We're also going to take that stuff apart, clean it, lubricate it, make sure that she's ready to go. All right, let's start up here in the right front of the vehicle. I wish I would have known about these wheel hangers many years ago in my career. They make life so much easier. One thing I'm probably going to have to do before this autocross event is actually put some different tires on. These are right about 2/32, right about at these wear bars right here. And I have shredded these, so we may actually be putting different wheels and tires on for the event. But I feel like I got pretty much every dollar out of these tires. All right, now that we got the wheel off, we can do a little bit better inspection. We'll notice here on our rotor, it actually looks like there's a little bit of hot spotting right along the center line of this rotor. This is probably the place where the pad grabs the most. We also got a little bit of grooves, which is not that big of a deal. I'm actually going to take the rotor off and use a brake rotor hone to just kind of get rid of this glazing that the rotor has before we put new pads on it. Our brake line looks perfect, no rubbing or anything like that. Our polyurethane sway bar bushings look good. Everything with the spring and shock absorber assembly looks fine. We still have that little bit of an issue with the CV boot. As we look at the control arm bushings, noticing something I'm not super thrilled with. It actually looks like the control arm bushing is split a bit right in this center opening. These are upgraded polyurethane bushings, so I don't know what I'm going to do at this point. The autocross event is coming up really quick, so I'm probably not going to do anything for that event, but I'm thinking that we'll probably end up taking these out and going back to OEM R32 solid rear bushings. But ultimately, that's not that big of a deal. Let's go ahead and get our brake components off. First up, let's get our dust caps off. Remember, these are from the Tyrol brake stiffening kit. Now we'll go ahead and take the slide pins out. Well, they still have plenty of grease on them. That's good. Go ahead and take our Phillips head screw out holding the rotor on. We'll remove our spring. Now we can slide our caliper off. When you set it down, make sure you don't pinch the brake line or anything like that. We got to take our caliper carrier bracket off on this car. So everything is now on the bench that at least is easy to pull off the car. Let's start by inspecting our guide pins. Remember, these are from that Tyrol Sport brake stiffening kit. So I'm going to clean the grease off, and what I'm actually looking for is any metal wear, galling, that kind of stuff, places where I can see damage to the metal, or maybe a place where we didn't have enough lubricant. All right, so if we look right here, this is probably the place there was a bit more contact from the piece on the caliper back there to the slide pin. You can see it, like you can see the difference. Look at how reflective it is here versus here. But I don't feel anything weird like there's actually metal missing. So we're just gonna clean this one up and put it back in. It looks like it's actually kind of all around on this whole side. Let's clean our other one up. I'm gonna guess that it's probably got about the same. You wanna make sure you clean any old grease off of these too. A little bit longer of a line where it looks like maybe there's a bit of wear. So I'm actually feeling pretty good about this. They do recommend if you're not doing high performance driving to take these out and clean them once a year. If you're doing high performance stuff, you should really be doing it after every event. So probably should have taken this out sooner to clean, but either way, it's not too bad. As I look at the rotor here, this is the part that faces the inside of the vehicle. You can actually see that it looks like the pad was either grabbing tighter at the bottom or hanging at the bottom. Look at right here, you can see it's a lighter color than it is towards the inside where the hub is. Now, when I first put these pads on, I did have an issue where the whole pad didn't seem to be making contact with the rotor. I called Hawk and they said that was normal, and after 500 or so miles it would go away, which it pretty much did. I'm also noticing there's a little nick right here on the rotor, and that's probably what caused these grooves, like it wore the pad down. So I'm gonna make sure that we don't have any issues with that, and if we do, I'll kind of sand it down. Now, because these are slotted rotors, nobody's really gonna be interested in turning these on a brake lathe. People are worried about the bit getting caught in the grooves and breaking or damaging the bit. So what we're gonna do is we're going to use a brake rotor hone, and we're just going to take some of this glazing off the surface. I don't think doing that is actually the best way to do it. Either new rotors or a proper resurface is the right way, but this is going to be better than just slapping new pads on it and possibly having an issue with the new pad and the old rotor not bedding in properly. The more I think about an inboard side of that rotor, here's our inboard pad. It looks okay. Let's actually measure it and see if maybe the inside is worn more than the outside or outside more than inside. We'll zero out our caliper, call that 19.02. And what do we have on the inboard side? 19.23. So we do have a bit more of a pad wear. If we look right here on the pad, you can see this part is darker than the top part. So it's not a huge discrepancy, but it is a little bit different. We also want to make sure that we're taking a good thorough look at the caliper carrier. You can see right here there's a little bit of wear, that shiny part with a little bit of rust in the middle. Those are the spots where the pads ride. So we're going to clean that up a bit and make sure we get a good surface for our new pads to ride on. Let's get that brake hone and take some of this glazing off of this rotor. All right, so this is a brake rotor hone. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to clean the surface of our brake rotor. This is not a replacement for a proper resurface. This is not a replacement for replacing the rotor. This is simply like one step better than pad slapping, which is just putting pads only on the car. This should get rid of any glazing or anything like that and make for a better but not ideal in a perfect world brake job. The important things to remember about this is a low speed tool. So you're gonna put it in your drill, you're gonna operate at about 500 to 600 RPM, which is pretty slow. Then we're just gonna go around the rotor and clean it up. All right, so we got our rotor cleaned up a little bit using the brake hone tool, which worked pretty well. It's not perfect, and I would have much rather had it completely resurfaced, but this is what we're going to go with. Next, what we want to do is we want to look at our caliper. I already showed you guys the spots that look like they may need a little attention. Now, a couple of things we can do. We can use sandpaper and clean this up. You don't really want to remove metal here. We're just looking to clean this up and make sure that our pads have a good surface. So what I like to do is use a wire wheel and just clean it up a little bit. Clean that up. All right, so our carrier looks pretty good now. Our rotor's nice and cleaned up. We do need to inspect our caliper before we go all back together. Let's take a look at our new pads that we're going to be installing. Again, these are from G-loc. This is going to be our inner pad because it has the clips that connect to the caliper. Noticing one thing though, compared to the OE pads, see how the OE pad has that groove in the pad and this channel down it? This one doesn't have that. What that probably means is that our brake wear indicator is not going to work on these pads. It's not a big deal. You can do one of two things. You can code out the brake wear indicator completely, which is probably what I will do, or you can just bypass it by taking the old brake wear indicator, cutting it, and splicing it together. All right, let's take a look at the caliper, and then we'll go ahead and put this bad boy back together. These pads look pretty legit though, too. I'm excited to get them on, get them bedded in, and give them a try. All right, let's take a look at this caliper, make sure she's happy. So we'll take a look at our dust boots. They look good. I don't see any leaking or anything like that. We're gonna clean some of this old grease out of our Tyrol Brake stiffening kit to make sure that that won't be a problem. And the way I like to clean this kind of stuff is to use one of these bottle brushes. This actually came with the turkey baster that I got to extract brake fluid out of the reservoir before we push the caliper pistons back, which I'll show you in just a minute. But let's clean this first. We'll go ahead and just clean any old grease out of here. Make sure the mounting surface is clean. Make sure these are still nice and snug. Take a look inside as best you can. Probably not going to be the easiest thing to see in there, but I don't see too much. And considering our pins looked pretty good, we're just going to go ahead and go with that. No leaks from our line. So we should be good to go ahead and press these two pistons back and then install our pads. Now before you put these pistons back, there's two things you can do. One, you can open the bleeder just a little bit. That'll allow the excess fluid to come out of the caliper. Or what I like to do is take the cap off the fluid reservoir, pull a little bit of brake fluid out from there, and then go ahead and push back your pistons. Our pads were pretty new, so we're not going to push a lot of fluid back through. If your pads were all the way worn out, you may want to take even more out. For pressing back this style of caliper is super easy. There's a number of ways to do it. I like to usually take the old brake pad, set it in the caliper, and then use a C-clamp to slowly push it back. You have one of the tools that's meant specifically for this, go ahead and use that. That works really well too. We just need to make sure that we're pressing both pistons back. You see it left a tiny little mark right there on our brake pad. That's okay, because if we ever put these back on, we're going to take a little bit off the surface of these, clean them up for a fresh, proper bed in. Now, before we put our pads in here, I want to get the rotor back on. That way we're not having to move the caliper around with a pad hanging in it. So we're going to set our caliper back to the side. We'll go ahead and get our nice, freshy rotor back on. Make sure you pay attention to where your screw hole was. We have our rotor on. Let's go ahead and put our pads in our caliper. First, we're going to start with the inboard pad. The inboard pad is the one with the clips on it. And on the driver's side, the inboard pad has a pad wear indicator sensor. So you're going to want to swap that over if you are retaining it. Assuming you're using different pads. Like I mentioned, these pads, they aren't going to work with. There's our inboard pad. Next, we'll put our caliper carrier back on. If you're reusing these bolts, you want to make sure that you clean them up a little bit. They're not required in replacement, but they do recommend that you clean them before reinstalling them. Then we're going to torque them to 125 Newton meters. Rotor's on, caliper carrier's on. Now it's time to finish up our pads. For the outboard pad, I actually like to take it and set it in the carrier like this, and then we just roll our caliper around, set it in place right there. Next, we'll take our guide pin, put a little bit of grease on it. I like to have it on the socket, that makes it a little easier. And then just try and make sure we get grease all the way down to the bottom and distribute it evenly. Do the same thing for the other one, and we'll go ahead and install them. Next, we are going to torque these down to 30 Newton meters if you have the Tyrol Sport stiffening kit. If you don't have the stiffening kit, it is only 25 Newton meters. And we will go ahead and put our caps back on. We are almost done with our front brakes. We got to put our retention spring back in. I like to start one side, get it in, get the other side down at the bottom or at the top, underneath the carrier, apply tension with my thumb, in this case of my right hand, and just push it into place. Now I am going to leave the wheel off here because we're going to go ahead and flush the brakes. We're basically doing the same thing on the back as we did for the front. Thread our wheel hanger in. In the rear, we didn't actually do as much as we did for the front. We did pads, we did rotors, we did brake lines. We also did H&R lowering springs and Bilstein shock absorbers. In addition to that, I replaced the bottom and the top plates for the spring. I do still need to do all the rear bushings, rear upper and lower control arm bushings. We'll be doing that at some point soon, but for now, let's just go ahead and get our rear brakes done. For the rear, we're also going to have to take off the caliper and the caliper carrier to get the rotor off. Now, if you're using that rotor hone, you can actually do that on the car, but it's a little bit easier to get to the back with it off. And since it's not terribly challenging to take them off, we're just going to go ahead and take the caliper and carrier off. Now you're going to need a 15mm wrench to counter hold and a 13mm socket or wrench to loosen the bolt. Also, when you're doing the rear, make sure you don't have the parking brake on or you will probably struggle to get the caliper off. Go ahead and slide our caliper down, take our pads off. Now we need to take our caliper carrier off. The R32 is actually the only Mark IV that you need to take the caliper carrier off in order to get the rear rotor off. And if I remember right, it's actually the only one where the carrier's not built into the wheel hub. You actually don't need to take this all the way off. I like to loosen both bolts. Then I'll take the top one out. Take our screw out for our rotor. Actually need to take our wheel hanger off too so that we can rock the rotor out. We got our rear setup on the bench. Here's the pads. The pads look pretty darn good. You can see a little bit right here where the pad was riding. We'll clean that up with a wire wheel just like we did the front. We also want to make sure that our dust boot holds the seal, so give it a tug. We can go ahead and pull it out, check our grease. This was black grease that I put in it when I did these the last time. Probably not going to clean these out at this point in time because it hasn't really been that long, but we do want to just make sure that everybody's happy. So we're good there. One thing on the bolts that hold caliper to the carrier, these are technically one-time use bolts. Notice they have thread locker on them. I don't have another set of these, and the new G-loc pads did not come with any hardware. So keep that in mind if you guys are buying those pads, they do not come with hardware. What we are going to do is we're going to clean all that old thread locker off and apply some new thread locker to it. The rotor looks pretty good. We don't have that weird hot spotting, half hot, half not on the back like we did the front. It just looks like it has a bit of a coat of glaze on it, so that's actually pretty good. What we'll do is we will go ahead and resurface this one just like we did the front. Next up, we are going to be cleaning our bolts that hold the caliper to the caliper carrier. Since I don't have new ones, we're just going to hit them with a little brake cleaner, run our thread chaser down, and get that old thread locker off, and then put some new thread locker on it. Next up, we're going to clean the carrier a little bit. We'll do just like we did the front, hit it with a wire wheel, just to get any dirt, rust, debris, grime, or whatever off of the carrier. Okay, here are our old pads, and here are the new ones. Now, one thing I'm noticing right away with these new ones versus the old ones is look at the springs. This one, they're pointing out and up quite a bit more than this one. These springs get pushed down by the caliper and actually help keep the pad in place. The fact that these are sticking up so high is actually a good thing because that means there's going to be plenty of tension on the pad. It may make putting the caliper on a little bit trickier. The caliper has a hole in the top and the middle, and if you don't get these in the right place, they'll actually stick up out of the hole. That's not the right way to do it. So we're going to make sure we take our time and get them in properly. Otherwise, they're race car red. Slide our rotor on. Go ahead and put our screw in that holds the rotor on. Next up, let's put our caliper carrier back on. These bolts for the caliper carrier get torqued to 80 Newton meters. Next up, we need to push the piston back on the caliper. This style twists back, so we're going to use a tool just like this. This thing's pretty old. I think I've got it before I started working at the dealership. And this is super easy. We use the one with the 2 pins on it. We set it in the caliper. We twist it back so that it's snug. We take a 14mm wrench and we'll slowly compress it back. We remove our tool. Now our piston's pressed all the way back. Our pads were pretty new, so that didn't take very long. If your pads are worn out, it's going to take a bit longer. Also, you really want to pay close attention to the dust boot. Make sure it doesn't get all twisted or bound up when you're twisting it back. Next up, time for our race car red brake pads. These simply slide in just like that. See the ledge right here, rides right here. Really couldn't be much easier. So notice these clips. This is what I was talking about that may be kind of challenging. Here is the opening of the caliper. You can see my glove back through it. We want to make sure these clips are not through this hole, otherwise the pads aren't seated properly. Time to put our caliper over our pads. Normally I get one bolt started and then rock it into place the rest of the way. Now you may have to apply a pretty good amount of pressure to the caliper towards the rotor, towards the front of the vehicle, in order to get this one to line up. All the while paying attention to this hole right here, making sure those spring clips aren't pushed through it. Once you have both the top and the bolt and the back of the caliper started, look right through this hole and make sure that there's no clips sticking out of it. You need one side on the top and one side on the bottom. Once that's good, tighten down your caliper bolts. Make sure to use your 15mm wrench to counter hold the slide pin and tighten it with a 13. We're gonna torque these bolts to 35 Newton meters. So we got everything bolted up, properly torqued. Let's do one more inspection. Again, make sure that your clips are in the proper place in this caliper. Now we're gonna do the exact same thing on the other side. If I find anything noteworthy, I'll let you guys know. All right, got the driver's side all finished up. Like I mentioned, you're not gonna be able to use the brake wear indicator with these. We can either bypass it right here at the connector or code that out. Everything looks good over here. The only thing I did notice is just like the passenger side, we do have a slight crack in this control arm bushing. So we're gonna need to get these bushings replaced pretty soon. Probably do it right after the autocross event. So the front looks good, and the back looks just as good as the front. Man, those brakes look cool. Those pads look cool up against the blue calipers. Everybody's torqued down here properly. Let's go ahead and check that brake fluid. All right, our pads and everything are on. Now it's time to deal with our brake fluid. We're probably gonna go ahead and flush them anyway, but before we do that, I'm gonna use these test strips to see just how contaminated our brake fluid is. See, one side is for brake fluid, one side is for coolant. Let's take it over to the reservoir and see how it looks. So I dipped the test strip in. Now what we do is we compare it to what it says on this card. Comparing the colors, looks like we're kind of somewhere in this 100 range, give or take. That's getting pretty close to actually needing to be serviced. Even though we could probably get away with not doing it, we're already 90% of the way there. Let's just make it happen. We're gonna go ahead and use our pressure bleeder. Of course, we need to take the reservoir cap off. We'll screw on our fitting here. We'll click our hose into our fitting. We'll pump up the bleeder. Want right about 1.5 bar. Make sure there's plenty of fluid in it, of course. Then we're gonna start at the right rear wheel. Remember that we're flushing, not bleeding. Some cars it's the same no matter which wheel you start. Others have a different procedure for bleed versus flush. For us, we're gonna start at the right rear because it is the furthest away from the brake fluid reservoir. Well, that's it. Our new brakes are on. Our brake fluid has been flushed. We did our full visual inspection. Everything checks out super good, minus those control arm bushings on the front control arms, rear bushings. We're gonna get those replaced ASAP. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and put the wheels back on, torque them properly, of course. I'm actually going to be putting on the Aristos that came on the car. The main reason I'm doing that is they came with BF Goodrich G-Force Comp 2s on them, and those are actually in better condition than my Indy 500. So we're gonna run those for the autocross event and see how they perform. And I'll go ahead and order another set of tires for the new speed wheels. After I get the wheels and tires on, we need to go ahead and test drive the car, bed the pads in, and make sure everything's cool. G-loc doesn't list a bed-in procedure for the GS. They only list them for the R line. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna follow the same procedure that I do for most all other brake pads, and that's gonna be pump the pedal, make sure that we have a good firm pedal. Then I'm gonna do a couple of low speeds, 2 to 3 mile an hour stops to make sure that the car stops. Then we'll gradually increase the speed, 5 to 10 miles per hour, a couple of stops. 30 to 40 miles per hour, we'll slow down but not stop, allowing the brakes to cool between each of those intervals. Then we'll go ahead and finish it up with a couple of good firm stops, and that should be enough to completely bed the pad in. After that, I'll be evaluating how they perform on the street, with initial bite, with when they're heat soaked, coming off the highway, that kind of thing. Also be evaluating them in a high performance situation where we may run the risk of having brake pad fade and see how they performed versus the Hawk HPS. One of the things I didn't love about the Hawk HPS is the initial bite was kind of weak. So I'm hoping that these G-loc pads do quite a bit better, and then we'll just keep on with it from there. All right, guys, questions or comments, drop them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Not bad, actually. Go for it. All right, consistent throttle. Wait, go.